and let's talk about pelicans. At the risk of sounding repetitive, I will just tell you that I thought writing a story about pelicans was going to be a piece of cake. Give me a week, I'll get it done. Well, I learned that they are so, there's so much richness to their history, to their diversity, to, I'll turn that off. There's just so much to learn about them that I think it really is a story worth sharing with you. There's probably a lot more to know, but this is all we could get into an hour or 45 minutes. There we go. So we're going to start with the pop quiz. I won't read it aloud. This is, you all know this by heart, but on the honor system, you can write down who wrote this famous little ditty, and we will get to that at the end. So this program, this is the basic outline of the program. What makes a bird a pelican? The section about the pelican lineage, I have been somewhat self-indulgent, but I hope it's entertaining. It goes back to how did birds actually evolve and what makes a bird, so I think before we get into what makes a pelican, it's good to know the cultural importance of pelicans. And we are going to take a look, just a glimpse at 6 of the other, there are 8 pelican species in all. We're going to take a look at 6 of them, and then we're going to take a close-up view of the pelicans that we see here in Florida. And what are the threats? The threats, past, present, and future. We're going to also then take a look at what it is we can do as responsible birders, responsible citizens of the world to help protect these birds going forward. What makes a bird a pelican? Well, if you thought the gular pouch, you would be halfway right. The gular pouch in these birds, the prairie chicken, the frigate bird, is actually utilized during courtship. These are studliness for a proxy for studliness. So that's not quite the same as a pelican. These other birds also have a gular pouch, but it's really an extension of their crop. So when they are eating and saving some food for later or to take back to the nest. But a pelican is quite different. Its entire lower mandible is the gular pouch. So this is the way the mandible has the upper and lower mandible. At rest, they are parallel, or pretty much parallel. And when they are feeding, this cantilevered beam just stretches out and creates really a mismatch, but it creates a tool. This is their beak is really their tool to catch fish and other. This, by the way, is an Australian pelican. That gular pouch is, I had to write it down because it's anisotropic tensile strength corrugated collagen, which means it's really stretchy. It's very much an accordion, and it's not a single layer. There are about 3 different layers. It's fully innervated, blood vessels, nerve endings, and that makes sense because they have to know when they've caught something, they have to be able to feel it. So the pelicans are the only birds with this kind of lower mandible. They've recently been moved around. There's been a lot of reshuffling. They used to be in a family with these other birds as recently as 2008. Now and that was, I think, based in large part on physical familiarity. DNA analysis has shown that's not quite right, that the birds most closely related to the pelicans are these African birds, the hammerkop and the shoebill, both of which look fairly prehistoric to our eyes, related to herons and egrets. So there are 8 species worldwide. 6 dabble and 2 dive. Now we think of pelicans as diving birds, but there are only 2 of those 8 species that dive, and it's based pretty much on weight. The two lightest birds are divers. Dabbling is not like a total up tails, all like duck. They keep their bodies steady, but their necks are long enough and their beaks are deep enough that they can just gather. And these look like American White Pelican buttocks to me. And there you got your diving bird. So they're two very specific, but only two, with very small variations, two feeding styles. The bird that we're most familiar with, the brown pelican, dives very streamlined. The minute his beak hits the water, it's open. You can see the structure, the bowing of the lower mandible and the stretching, the corrugated stretching of the gular pouch. And this is the two diving birds have the maximum hydrodynamic loading. And you didn't get much catch in that. The dabbler, the American White Pelican, feeds quite differently. They feed the brown pelican, it's every pelican for itself. The American White Pelican hunt collectively. They will form circles and they will push fish toward each other and then scoop them up. They have less hydrodynamic loading. They have less surface area of the couch. They don't need as big a pouch in order to pick up out of the water. They don't need that at all, but they do work collectively. Now that fish is going to have to be turned around. He can't take that fish down backwards. They have to close the mandibles, drain most of the water out, and get that fish headed head first down the hatch. And this is a great example. You can see all these blood vessels in here. So this is wonderful living tissue, a point that we come back to later. So just so as you know. Now they're mouth breathers because even though some are freshwater, they're like albatross and the tube noses, where they take the salt in the fish and the salt water, then that's filtered out of their blood. So they don't have nares up here. What they do though is have this lobe, the central canal, and that hook at the end of the bill is actually the faucet. That's the tip of the faucet, and that's where they extrude the salt. So when did they evolve these amazing strategies? Well, I'm going to be indulging myself. We're going to take a look back. We're going to start, move right along from 250 million years ago. There was a great dying when pretty much 95% of life on Earth, died. The few creatures that were left fairly rapidly, they weren't reptilian, but they fairly rapidly evolved into reptiles from just the very few species that were left. That was a real pinch point in evolution. Shortly thereafter, reptiles split into dinosaurs and pterosaurs, 230. And so you might imagine the flighted pterosaurs were the antecedent of our birds, our avians. That's not how it worked out at all. That's not what was the case. Pterosaurs had muscled flight, probably more closely resembling what we know for bats. It was these extended digits. These were converted hands, extended digits, and webbing between the digits. Interestingly, there are fossil remains of a pterosaur that had a pelican-like feeding strategy. So that strategy had evolved along a different pathway. So dinosaurs, the reptiles split, now the dinosaurs split, and they split into avian and non-avian, and that's about 160 million years ago. So birds have been around a long, long time, but they haven't had all the skills that we associate with birds. They each had to evolve separately. And we think of avian, they've got the feathers, right? Well, in part, but even non-avian dinosaurs had feathers. The primary selective change was in the bones. Physically, avian dinosaurs changed the structure of their pelvis. And so this made them more aerodynamic. And non-avian kept these bones in more of a triangle. The bones became hollow. Now, this is a good preparatory step for flight because they are lighter. They're incredibly strong. And because they were light, they were a precursor for flight, but that's not why, that was not the first benefit, let's put it this way. Bones are part of the respiratory system of the bird. So you have the lungs and you have the air sacs, and there's this kind of circular motion. And so these bones here are connected to the forward air sacs. And so we're pneumatizing these bones, and these are the rear. So the bird has a capacity to intake oxygen that will provide it with tremendous amounts of energy. Feathers do play a role as well, because when they first switched to the split between avian and non-avian, all the feathers were these stage 1, 2, and 3. They were for decoration or for warmth. If you want to fly, you're going to need keratin B. And that is what keratin B creates what we think of as feathers, with the barbs and the barbules and the hooklets and so forth. So that strong keratin is what gives the structure to a feather, that gives it the ability to withstand downbeat pressure of a wing. And if you don't have keratin B, you're never going to fly. So when did they fly? Well, proto-birds came around a long time ago, but you can see they still have lots of fingers. They still have a long tail. They're going nicely with what artists imagine with the feathers. Archaeopteryx, often thought of the first bird, was not a bird. Look at this. The pelvis is wrong, still has these vertebrae up here, still has fingers and phalanges, compared to a modern bird that has all the things that we recognize as a bird. But about 130 million years ago, so they've actually moved along, it's just about 30 million years, birds did achieve flight. And this is a fossil from China, where they were able to extract keratin, and they could see the barbs, and they were able to extract the keratin, and also the pelvic structure was right. So we know that birds finally had all the building blocks in place to achieve flight about 130 million years ago. Non-avian dinosaurs, to just repeat, will never achieve flight. Their feathers were only ever going to be for warmth and for decoration. So now we got 90 million, 80 million years, birds, avian dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, they're kind of evolving alongside each other. And then we have the next big extinction event. And this just kind of sums it up. We had the first extinction event, we split some more, non-avian, they achieved some flight, and then 65 million years ago with the meteor, all non-avian dinosaurs, all pterosaurs became extinct. And some avian dinosaurs did, but what remained are what we think of as modern birds. So now they've got 65 million years, and they've lost a lot of their competition because the non-avian dinosaurs were competing for the resources. So they have 65 million years, a lot less pressure on them. And so birds, the evolution of birds really hit the fast track. And between both structure, this hornbill up here, the pretty wild, and then also in terms of the colors and strengths and designs of their feathers. And that affected behavior. So we go from a flightless bird, a ratite bird, birds who essentially sedentary. We have birds that can fly 8 days nonstop, and we have birds that go to sea for 2 years and never come back to land. So the variety of lifestyles of birds is tremendous. what they've done with their feathers, their courtship and mating rituals with feathers, this truly extravagant display. And speaking of extravagant display, so within the class of Chordata, the phylum Chordata, birds are the most diverse class within that, and they continued through the records to see that they've continued to evolve for all of those 65 million years. There's one exception, however, and that would be the pelican. The pelican hit its maximum set of efficiency 30 million years ago. Fossilized pelican remains are identical to the morphology of existing pelicans. I'm not quite sure what to make of that, other than that they hit the jackpot with this design, and they had no selective pressure to change anymore. Now they change very slightly. When we look at the 8 species, you'll see really pretty subtle distinctions between them. But that mandible was established 30 million years ago and has remained identical. So there is some variety. The eight birds that we're going to look at, 6 of them quickly. 4 are white, 2 are brown, 2 are beige, and we know we have 6 dabblers and 2 divers. At least there are different theories, but the theory that is most clear is that they evolved their old world birds, and that somewhere in continental drift, some pelicans made it into the New World and stayed. So here they are, the Dalmatian great white. So we'll take a quick look at these. The Dalmatian crispus. It is the world's largest freshwater bird. It has a wingspan of 11.5 feet, and you can see a very narrow gular pouch. It doesn't descend very far at all. Eastern European range, and they are near threatened. I've got a little block on my, here we go. They are near threatened status. They are one of the birds that is in some trouble. Okay, there we go. I'm having trouble. We're the great white pelican. This is an immense bird. It's not, there are different ways to measure stem to stern, weight, wingspan, but this wingspan of the great white pelican is the largest in the world. The Australian pelican, largest, I mean, they're superlative birds. There's something's going on for all of them. The largest bill of any living bird. They plunge, they go a little deeper than dabbling. They plunge, but only from the surface of the water. The pink-backed pelican, least concern. You can see the little pink here. And again, a gular pouch that is beautifully corrugated, but not a large pouch. Whoopsie. We have the spot-billed pelican, also known as the gray pelican. And this pelican is near threatened status. Very small range in South Asia. And this, I just like this picture because you can see the spots on the bill. So those are our old world pelicans. And then we come to the new world. So we're going to start with the Peruvian pelican. This is also a bird that is in serious trouble. With the warming, this is a diver. It's a shallow diver. It's really about twice the size of our brown pelicans. It doesn't dive from as high, but it dives and it's getting cold water fish in the Humboldt Current. Well, what happens during El Nino events that are happening more and more frequently and warming water is that the sardines and the small fish they need to thrive are beyond their dive range. So this is a bird that is in some serious trouble. The most closely related to this bird is the bird we know, the brown pelican. And they're the same species, but there are subspecies. There are about 5 subspecies, and you can see this is, they're all pretty local, although they move around. They're not migratory in the sense that they pursue resources on a seasonal basis, but they do move around. And so you would say, well, you know, is there any chance that the Peruvian penguins might hybridize? You know, it'll give them some chance. And the answer is no. Even when their range, it doesn't really show it on the map, but when their range overlaps, they don't. The Peruvian penguin is twice the size of the brown penguin. It is the smallest of all the penguins, which is what, you know, these giant birds, absent the American white penguin in the, did I say penguin? Oh, pelican in the winter. It's about the biggest bird we've got, and yet it is the smallest of the pelicans, and it is the highest diver. And so there's obviously a weight to dive ratio. The biggest just dip, the Peruvian penguin, twice the size, shallow diver. The brown pelican can dive from 60 feet, 40 miles an hour. It doesn't hurt itself because it has air sacs under the breast skin and in the throat. It rotates the body to protect the esophagus and trachea. And they dive at such a steep angle as to reduce aiming errors. And you can see they get streamlined pretty fast. So the minute he makes contact, those wings go back. And down the hatch, look at that corrugated collagen fibrils. I hope I said that right. And again, just to emphasize, this is fully living flesh with blood and nerves in here. So they're kind of tough for the beginning birder because they change plumage for life phases. This is a young bird. When they're flying and they got that pale tummy, they get generally darker. This is a mature bird, and this is a mature with the white head, and then this is the mature breeding bird with the brown, that very dark chocolate stripe down the nape. There's some facultative brood reduction. By that I mean siblicide. The first to hatch is probably going to be the one to survive. As we know, pelicans brood by covering the eggs with their feet, and we can talk about DDT in a bit. So they finally fledge 2 to 3 months, and then the youngsters go off and become hooligans for 3 to 5 years, and juvenile groups stay together. And so squadrons, pods, or scoops. When we were in Costa Rica, we were told that they were the Costa Rican Air Force, because if you probably know, Costa Rica doesn't have any military. So these are the Costa Rican Air Force. They were endangered, and critically so, although they were in trouble before 1970. They were finally removed from the endangered list in 2009. And they're doing okay. They're doing okay. Now, the white pelican is another huge bird, but what does it? It is not the biggest of anything. Weighs 20 pounds. I mean, it's a big bird. Wingspan of more than 10 feet. It is the only migratory pelican. All of the others, you know, they might move around within the territory, but this is a truly migratory bird, and by that it means it has a seasonal alteration of landscape to maximize access to food. And so they come down here for the winter. This is their range, and then they migrate up to their breeding grounds in the upper Midwest and into Canada. So they're second to the California condor in wingspan, and second to the trumpeter swan in weight. They are, even if they come in second, it's a superlative bird. So you're all dying to know what the lump on the upper mandible is called. There it is for you, a nuptial tubercle. The American White Pelican is the only bird in the world to have this, and it's a signal of readiness to breed. It is very common in fish. There are the nuptial tubercles right here, but the American White Pelican is the only bird and once they're bred, that will fall off. And they breed in massive sites, 50,000 pairs to a site, very similar to the brown pelican, 30 days to hatch. They're hatched by under the feet of the parent, and they do definitely engage in the first to hatch is going to engage in siblicide. So they get their fluff. They get their fluff at 10 days. And then at about 3 weeks, they leave the nest. They're still cared for by their parents individually, but they form a thermally protected creche, is what it's called. So they fledged and they're cared for, but they just have the additional protection of the extra body heat. As we know, they're cooperative feeders. Fish, salamanders, 16 years in wild is typical. They were hunted for their feathers. And this is, they protected in 1908 by Teddy Roosevelt. And whether that meant he wanted more birds so that they could be hunted, it's not really clear. But for them, DDT was never a concern because they were not around areas where there was any spraying and there was no agricultural runoff. So they didn't come under attack from DDT. But they were hunted for their beautiful, beautiful feathers, of which they had many, but now they're of least concern. And this is what we're seeing. They take off from the north and they come flying down in different formations, and it's always a sight to behold in the fall. Now, when they're here, they're mostly found in the shallow Gulf estuaries. That's where the fish are going to be closer to the surface. But when we have a cold spell, they're going to be moving into inland freshwater ponds. So they can do fresh or salt. They're able to manage a variety. So there are, the fish in those freshwater ponds aren't as deep and they're more available to them. Now, they're cooperative feeders, but they do squabble sometimes. I just like this picture. Who is going to get that poor little fish? So we're just going to briefly look at pelicans in culture, but there was more to this, but I just thought we could get bogged down. The god Honut in ancient Egypt assured as a pelican, represented as a pelican, saved passage to the afterlife. In the New World, the pelican was a part of the iconography of, I think this was the Aztecs, but I think in all of the pre-Columbian civilizations, so in textiles and also in pottery, the pelican is well represented. In ancient Persia, the pelican was seen as a beneficent bird. It was a bird that really looked after and protected other birds. And I couldn't find any linkage, but I suspect there may have been some linkage to a really critical theory that was adopted pre-Christian, that the legend of selflessness, the pelican in her piety. And what the pelican in her piety is doing is sacrificing herself for her offspring. And a lot of this art was designed and executed by people who'd never seen a pelican, but they was a bird, it was close enough. Well, interestingly, in 2nd century, Christians adopted this pre-Christian legend of the selfless mother, and in part that was very much for Mary, or just, self-sacrifice was to be admired and a goal. And so clearly people had never seen a pelican, but they really liked the idea. The person who liked the idea the most, Queen Elizabeth, yes, the sacrificing mother of her country. This is the famous pelican portrait, and you can see the pelican, this big, beautiful brooch on her gown is the pelican. So she positioned herself as the selfless mother of her country. And if you too would like to position yourself as the selfless mother of your family or your country, you can get a badge. And they do look a little more appropriate, the beak. This is where it gets sad. So you're going to want to get out your tissues. What are the threats? The threats are you and me and the rest of us. So what we're going to do is this DDT is good for me. I found that image everywhere. It actually started in 1939 with spraying crops and animals that we sprayed each other. And the idea was to get rid of pests because insects, of course, were pests and nobody really understood the great circle of life and how it survived this. So let's just kill them. Okay, let's just kill them. And that's what we did. And DDT was a perfect pesticide. It worked in a number of ways. The way it affected the pelicans most was because I'll show you how. Look at this little guy over here. So it affects birds in different ways. So for the small birds, it was powerful enough to create nerve and muscle damage, led to seizures, led to death. The bioaccumulation in certain raptors when the animals were dying and if they were eating carrion or just where there was bioaccumulation. So the peregrine falcon, bald eagle, they were also, their eggs were also disrupted. The calcium metabolism was disrupted, but the pelicans particularly, because they were getting it through the fish, because it was a pesticide as well as an insecticide, and it drained into the water. Got so bad that in 1963, there were no pelicans. The eastern brown pelican was a state bird, and there were no more pelicans left in Louisiana. So good news, and I've put this in recently because I think it's really important to show that one person can champion and lead change. And so that's would kind of all be Rachel Carson, but we can all do our bit to spread the message. Well, her message was that we're killing our birds. And if we kill the birds, that it's just going to be a snowball effect. So Silent Spring, and that really launched the environmental movement. She met a lot of pushback, which we don't need to go into, but eventually Stockholm Agreement, and then in the US, DDT was banned. It takes a while, it's persistent in the environment for a number of years, but not permanently. So what other, we have pollution of habitat. And we know that there's been a lot done to, there's been a lot of consciousness and raising awareness of that. And so I think as a rule, there's much more preservation of pristine habitat. We never learn. So of course, then oil spills are another big problem. So you can only imagine that that bird did not make it. Most of the birds didn't make it. You can see how she's holding that bird with her finger between the mandibles. That's because they're mouth breathers. So she's looking after that bird. Did that bird make it? Well, there are 210 million gallons. Audubon's estimate is 1 million birds were killed outright. And this is a sad story. Of the 5,000 birds rescued, only 582 were successfully rehabilitated. Now, whether that means the birds perished or whether those birds were transferred to a permanent facility, I really couldn't drill down into that, but the numbers are terrible. So here's another problem: overfishing, and it's a big problem for a number of creatures, including the whales and sea lion pups. But brown pelicans in California suffered unprecedented reproductive failures due to the lack of sardines or other forage fish. Well, that's not going to turn around in a heartbeat based on the continued overfishing. So that is a terrible threat. How about sea level rise? We let this run through a few times. There you go. Doesn't look good. Where's Miami? Oops. Miami is apparently being saved here. But anyway, so sea level rise, as predicted by NOAA, is looking pretty dire. Now, well, mangroves, which is one, especially in Florida, the rookeries are in mangroves primarily. Will they be able to move as quickly as the sea level rises? Well, I for one really have no idea. They can move pretty quickly, as we can see from the growth of mangrove islands. This is pretty sickening. There was a rash of deliberate pelican mutilations in Southern California where birds' wings were broken. And could you just weep? Look at what happened to that poor bird on the right. I don't know. I just can't imagine. That was deliberate, but much of the problem is because careless mutilations. And this is where, when particularly in the marine environment, this estimate 700 pelicans a year, thousands more injured, and these have to be ghastly deaths. They just have to be terrible. So what do you do if you hook a pelican? Okay, everybody get your notepads out. So if you hook a pelican, you do not cut it loose. No, you don't. You net it, and this is one number you can take down, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. You hook it, you net it, you cut the barb off, you remove it, and you can release it. Gets a little more involved. You should have a partner, put a shirt over the bird's eyes. They probably won't poke your eye out like a heron would. Check the bird all over for any other injuries. There's a number down here, 1-888-404-3922. Very carefully point the bird to the water and release it. If it's more seriously injured, oh, here you go. So please don't feed the birds. We do know that his bill can hold more than his belly can, but it holds full, whole fish that go down head first with the scales dynamically directed so that the bird doesn't injure itself. If you start throwing cut fillets and so forth, the bird is going to get really hurt. So what if you find an injured pelican? Now, this is an injured pelican. This is a bird that is not getting its food down its throat, and it's also becoming dehydrated. So this is the kind of bird that, and this is another kind of injury that's less obvious. Now you can see the nice straight neck here versus this neck here. This is a bird that is full of bones, and whether they're piercing the esophagus or not, that's up for a wildlife rehabber to tell us. But those are the two kinds of injuries you'd see, other than injuries of monofilament tied up around feet or something. But this is one that's more subtle, and to look for that. So if you see a bird that really does need help, you got everybody's pen and paper ready. For those of us who are in the Suncoast area, you would call the Wildlife Center of Venice. They don't have a public viewing. They don't keep birds really long term, but if they can restore them, if they can't be released, did everybody get that number? Then they will be sent to the Peace River Wildlife Center in Punta Gorda. You can take down that number too. And they do have a facility for long-term birds that can't be released back into the public. So if you get that kind of injury, what happens? Well, the first thing they have to do is rehydrate the bird and nourish the bird, and then start building some of these injuries are so severe, I'm not sure quite what they do. They use duct tape and they use staples, and they try everything to get the flesh to mend. And if they are stabilized, they can't be released, they can have a wonderful life in retirement in Punta Gorda. So things could look up for the pelicans if they're safely caught and handled correctly. And if you haven't been down there, it's a lovely place to go. They've got a great pelican display. So who wrote What a Wonderful Bird is the Pelican? Well, it actually wasn't Ogden Nash. It's always attributed to him, but he was a birder wannabe, and he of course wrote wonderful poems about animals. But he was an Audubon, and he did not write that little ditty. It was written about the time he was born by this fellow, Dixon Lanier Merritt, in 1910. Ogden Nash was born in 1911, and he was a wonderful man, a little enigmatic. He had a difficult childhood, but he was very much like Nash. But in addition, he was a legitimate ornithologist. And so he wrote that little ditty after visiting some pelicans in London.